In 1998, an Amish man named Eli Stoltzfus showed me a glass jar on a pantry shelf in Strasburg, Pennsylvania. It cost about $4 to put together. It used no electricity. It made no sound. And it was doing the exact same job as your $300 dehumidifier, quietly in the corner, the way it had been done for more than 140 years. My name is Eli Yoder. That jar pulls something like a pint and a half of water out of the air every single day. No motor, no fan, no power bill. No compressor to seize up in 3 years and land in a dumpster. And here is the part that ought to make you tilt your head. The dehumidifier industry in North America brings in around $3.8 billion a year. They cannot sell you a mason jar. There is no patent on a handful of salt and a square of cloth. So it is no surprise the jar never shows up in an advertisement. Today I am going to show you the 3 ingredients, the chemistry behind why it works, which nobody fully understood until 1903, and the exact spots in your house where one of these jars does what no machine can. And if your house was built in 1972, not 1873, stay with me, because this works just as well in an ordinary ranch basement as it does in an old stone farmhouse. Your basement, your closet, your gun safe, same jar, same chemistry. Stay to the end, because there is one mistake almost every YouTube tutorial makes when they try to copy this, and it is the exact reason theirs leaks brine all over the shelf and yours will not. Let me start with what is in the jar, because that is what everyone wants to know first. 3 ingredients, only 3. The first is calcium chloride, a white, slightly translucent salt that looks a little like coarse rock candy when you pour it into your palm. The second is a small piece of unbleached muslin cloth cut into a square about 6 inches across, the kind of cloth your grandmother used to strain jelly. The third is a length of ordinary cotton string, plain butcher's twine, the kind you buy for a couple dollars a spool at any hardware store. That is it. Calcium chloride, muslin, twine. The jar itself is just a standard quart mason jar, the same kind that has been made since the 1800s, the kind you probably have a dozen of in a drawer right now. Buy everything new at retail, and the whole thing comes to about $3.90. Call it $4. That is where the $4 jar gets its name. Now, let me tell you why it works. Because the chemistry here is genuinely beautiful, and once you understand it, you will never look at a plug-in dehumidifier the same way again. Calcium chloride is what chemists call a deliquescent salt. That word, deliquescent, comes from the Latin for to melt away. Certain salts have such a powerful pull on water molecules that they will literally drag water vapor right out of the surrounding air and dissolve themselves in the water they collect. Most salts do not do this. Ordinary table salt will clump a little in a humid kitchen, but it will not flood itself with water. Calcium chloride is different. It is one of the most aggressive deliquescent salts on Earth, and the pull it exerts on water vapor is relentless. A single gram of it, sitting in a room at 70% humidity, will pull roughly 1.5 times its own weight in water out of the air within 24 hours. Let me say that again, slowly, because it is astonishing and most people do not believe it the first time. 1 gram of this salt pulls 1.5 grams of water out of the air around it in a single day. No electricity, no moving parts, no sound, it does not run on anything, it does not plug into anything. It simply sits there and does what its molecular nature compels it to do, which is reach out and grab every water molecule that drifts near it. A single pound of calcium chloride, which costs a couple of dollars at any farm supply store, will absorb close to 1.5 pounds of water before it is spent and turns entirely to brine. That is nearly 1.5 pints of liquid water pulled silently out of the air in your basement or your closet by something that weighs less than a loaf of bread and costs less than a candy bar. There is no battery in it, there is nothing to charge, there is nothing to break. It is, in a real sense, the simplest machine ever built, except it is not a machine at all. It is just chemistry doing what chemistry does. The Amish did not invent this chemistry, of course. They could not have. The deep molecular behavior of these salts was not fully described until the work of the Swedish chemist Svante Arrhenius in the 1880s, who won the Nobel Prize in 1903 for his theories on how salts dissociate in water. The French chemist Antoine Baume had written about deliquescent salts even earlier, back in 1773. But the Amish did not need the Nobel Prize to know it worked. They learned it the way they learn everything, by watching generation after generation. Calcium chloride became cheap and widely available after the Belgian chemist Ernest Solvay developed his process for making soda ash in the 1860s, and by the 1870s it was pouring out of factories as an industrial byproduct nobody quite knew what to do with. It got sold by the barrel to farmers and road crews to settle dust on dirt roads. And somewhere in the Pennsylvania Dutch farm country, somebody figured out that a handful of that cheap salt in a jar with a little cloth over the top would pull the damp right out of a root cellar. There are old household ledgers from those communities that record the practice well back into the 1870s. One that survives in a historical archive notes a salt jar set in a cheese room in the fall, 2 pounds, lasting clear through till spring. Picture that. 2 pounds of calcium chloride sitting in a cheese aging room from October to April, keeping the humidity steady enough that the wheels of farmers' cheese did not grow the black mold that had ruined batches in years before, for 7 straight months on a couple pounds of salt that cost about 15 cents at the time. Now, run that same job against a modern electric dehumidifier. To dry that room for 7 months, the machine would burn somewhere between 400 and 700 kilowatt hours of electricity, which at today's residential rates costs you $60 to $120 just in power. And that is before you even buy the machine, which runs $200 to $400 and lasts, on average, 3 to 5 years before the compressor gives out or the fan motor seizes and you are back at the store buying another one. So on one side of the ledger you have a couple pounds of salt and a glass jar that will outlive you. On the other side you have a machine that costs hundreds to buy, dozens to run every year, dies on a schedule, and leaves a pile of plastic and leaking refrigerant behind when it goes. The two columns are not close. They are not in the same universe. That farm wife in the 1870s writing 2 pounds lasts till spring in her ledger by candlelight had already worked out something that $3.8 billion of modern advertising has spent decades trying to make you forget. Now, let me walk you through how the jar is actually put together, because the construction matters, and this is where that one mistake comes in, the one almost every tutorial online gets wrong. First, you fill your quart mason jar about 2/3 full with calcium chloride pellets. Not flakes, not powder. Pellets, the little round beads about the size of a peppercorn, sold in 50-pound bags at any farm store for under $25. The pellet form matters, because powder packs down tight and only the top layer ever touches the air, while the pellets leave gaps between them so the vapor can work its way all the way down through the jar and every bead does its share. One bag, by the way, keeps 4 or 5 jars going around a house for the better part of a decade. That works out to roughly $2.40 a year for whole house dehumidification. Less than 1 cup of gas station coffee for the whole year, for the whole house. Second, you stretch your square of unbleached muslin taut over the mouth of the jar and tie it down with the cotton twine, 3 wraps around the lip and a square knot to hold it. The muslin has to be unbleached, and people skip past this, but it matters because the bleaching process leaves chlorine compounds in the cloth that react with the salt over time and give off a faint sour smell that will have you blaming the jar for a problem the bleach caused. It needs to be woven tight enough that the pellets cannot fall through, but loose enough that vapor passes freely. Here is the simple test. Hold the cloth up to a bright window. If you can see pinpricks of light through the weave but cannot make out the shapes of objects behind it, you have exactly the right grade. And now the third step, the one everybody gets wrong, the reason half the people who try this online give up and call it a scam: you do not put the metal lid back on the jar. You leave the muslin as the only cover. Here is why people fail. They have spent their whole lives closing jars with the metal lid, so it feels wrong to leave a jar open, and they screw the metal lid down over the cloth to make it tidy, and that lid seals the jar off and blocks the water vapor from ever reaching the salt. The jar sits there doing absolutely nothing, no brine forms, and they decide the whole method is a hoax and go buy another machine. The muslin alone is the cover. That is the entire secret that the tutorials miss. The vapor passes through the open weave of the cloth, the salt grabs it and holds it, and the water collects in the bottom of the jar as a clear, slightly thick brine that looks like very thin maple syrup. When the jar is about half full of brine, which takes 4 to 8 weeks depending on how damp the room is. You carefully lift off the cloth, pour the brine out, refill the jar with fresh pellets, retie the cloth, and you are good for another month or two. That is the whole maintenance. A glance every week or so, and a refill every month or two. And that brine is not waste, which is the part the Amish love. In winter, they pour it on the front steps and the walkways as a de-icer, because calcium chloride brine stays liquid far below the freezing point of plain water and melts ice better than rock salt, and gentler on concrete too. In summer, a little of it on the gravel drive keeps the dust down, the very same use the old road crews found. Nothing goes in the trash. The same salt that dried your basement in March is melting the ice off your porch in December. But here is where the math gets serious. In 2007, in Holmes County, Ohio, I met a furniture maker named Mose Yoder, 61 years old, who built solid cherry and walnut pieces for customers who drove in from Cleveland and Columbus and as far as Pittsburgh. In a hardwood furniture shop, humidity control is not a luxury, it is the whole game. It is the difference between a chest of drawers that lasts 6 generations and one that splits down the middle the first winter after it is delivered. Wood is alive even after it is cut. It swells when it takes on moisture and it shrinks when it releases it. And a piece built in a damp shop at 70% humidity and then delivered into a house where the winter furnace has dropped the air to 20% will crack, warp, pop its joints loose, and twist its drawer fronts into shapes like potato chips. A furniture maker who cannot control his humidity is a furniture maker who will not keep his customers. The day I visited Mose in August, his shop read 42% relative humidity, just about dead on perfect for fine woodworking. Outside that same day, it was 87%. Step out his door and the air was thick enough to wear. Step back in and it was dry and steady. And he had no electricity in that shop. No air conditioning, no machine of any kind. What he had was 14-quart jars of calcium chloride lined up on shelves around the room and a single humidity gauge hanging on the wall by his workbench so he could keep an eye on the number. 14 jars! He emptied each one about every 6 weeks during the humid summer months and about every 3 months in the drier winter. His total spending on humidity control for the entire year, the salt, the cloth, the string, all of it, came to about $31. The electric equivalent for a shop that size, running through the 6 humid months, would have cost him several $100s a year in electricity alone, plus the price of at least 2 commercial-grade machines at around $600 each, plus the near certainty of replacing them every few years when the compressors failed. And Moses' system, he told me, has exactly one failure mode, which is running out of salt, and the 50-pound bag in the corner of the shop solves that problem for years at a stretch. He will pass that shop to his sons, and the jars will outlast him. So this is the moment to tell you where to get everything in one place. Every method I have pulled out of these communities, the jars, the recipes, the building tricks, all of it is gathered together in the description below in something called the Amish Home System. Now stay right here, because I want to answer the question I know you are already asking, and then show you exactly where in your own house these jars belong. The question is this: if it works so well, and it is so cheap, why isn't everyone doing it? And I want to answer that honestly, in 3 parts, because I am not going to insult you with a simple villain story. Part 1 is money, and it is the plain truth. Nobody builds a billion-dollar business selling mason jars and salt. There is nothing to patent, no yearly upgrade, no service contract, no repeat sale. The dehumidifier industry makes about $3.8 billion a year in North America, and all of that money buys advertising. And all of that advertising is built to keep you asking which machine to buy, never whether you need a machine at all. Part 2 is convenience, and here the honest answer is that the jar asks something of you. You have to glance at it, pour out the brine, refill the salt, maybe 10 minutes per jar per month. That is not much, but in a plug-it-in-and-forget-it culture, it is apparently enough to stop most people. And part 3 is scale. And this is where I will be straight with you, because your trust matters more to me than a clean pitch. The jar is superb for small and medium spaces, up to about 400 square feet each. A basement, a closet, a pantry, a workshop, a gun safe, a camper, a cellar. For an entire 3,000 square foot modern house that has to hold an exact humidity number, you would need more jars than most people want to manage, and at that point the electric unit starts to make sense again. I am not going to tell you the jar does everything. I am telling you it does the things that actually plague most homes better and cheaper than the machine. And here is the part nobody tells you. This works in a 1972 ranch in Ohio just as well as it works in an 1873 stone farmhouse in Pennsylvania. The chemistry does not care how old your house is or who built it. Let me give you the 4 places that matter most. In order, first, the basement. The single most important spot in nearly every home, because that is where the damp starts. And damp in a basement does not stay in the basement. The mold spores ride up through the air handler and end up in the air you breathe in your bedroom. The moisture soaks into floor joists and beams and rots them slowly over years into a repair that costs tens of thousands. The boxes of books and photos and Christmas decorations and the things your parents left you sit down there quietly ruining. 1 quart jar in a typical 8 to 100 to 1,200 square foot basement can drop the relative humidity 10 to 15 points, which is very often the entire difference between a basement that grows mold and one that stays dry and sound. For a larger basement, set 2 or 3 jars in different corners so the coverage is even. Second, the closet, especially any closet that holds leather or wool. Moisture displaces the natural oils in leather, so your good shoes and your jacket crack and stiffen and pick up a permanent musty smell, and moisture feeds mold colonies down deep in wool fibers where you cannot reach them. And once that smell sets in, no amount of cedar blocks will ever pull it back out. A small jar in the corner of that closet prevents the whole thing for pennies a day. Third, the pantry, if you store any dry goods, flour, sugar, rice, beans, pasta, coffee. Every one of those foods pulls moisture straight out of the air, and once they take on too much, they cake into solid bricks, they spoil faster, and they draw the pantry moths and weevils that turn a full shelf into a loss. A jar in the pantry keeps the dry goods dry and stretches their shelf life by months, which is real money in a year. And fourth, the gun safe, which is one of the best applications of all, because a safe is a sealed steel box, and even a small amount of trapped humidity inside it will rust through the protective finish on every firearm in there in a single damp season, ruining tools worth thousands. 1 small jar inside the safe, swapped out every 6 months, holds the interior right in the ideal 40 to 50% range and keeps every piece in there clean. Beyond those 4, the very same jar quietly handles campers and RVs that sit in storage all winter, boats sealed up on land, rented storage units full of furniture, converted wine cellars where the corks need steady humidity, and even a tackle box or a toolbox where a little salt in a breathable pouch stops the rust. One idea, a dozen uses, the same $4 jar every time. Let me show you one case that drove it home for me, because it is the kind of test that settles the question. A few years back, a man up in northern Michigan was trying to winterize the family cabin on a river, a place that had been in his family since the 1950s. And every single spring, for as long as anyone could remember, they opened it up in April to the same depressing sight. A thin fur of mold on the upholstered furniture, a musty smell soaked into the bedding, a white bloom of mildew creeping across the leather-bound books in the little library. It happened every year, without fail, because the cabin sat sealed and cold and damp through the whole Michigan winter with nobody there to air it out, and they had tried everything the hardware store sold them. The disposable moisture-absorbing buckets filled up and overflowed in about 3 weeks, 4 months short of the job. The electric dehumidifier was useless because the power was shut off at the cabin all winter, and there was nothing to plug it into. Battery-powered units died in a week. The little silica gel packets soaked up maybe a teaspoon of water and then sat there saturated and done. Nothing the store sold could last an unattended winter. So he tried the jar, 4-quart jars, 1 in each of the 2 bedrooms, 1 in the living room, and 1 in the kitchen pantry, about 2 pounds of calcium chloride in each, $9 or $10 of salt all told. He locked the cabin up in early November and did not come back until late April, almost 6 full months later. When he opened the door that spring, the first thing he noticed was the smell, or rather, the complete absence of it. No must, no mildew, no damp wood. The air smelled like nothing at all, which in that cabin was a small miracle. The second thing he noticed was the jars. Each one was about 3/4 full of brine, which meant the four of them together had pulled somewhere between 20 and 28 pints of water out of that cabin over the winter. Call it 2.5 to 3.5 gallons of water, dragged silently out of the air while the place sat empty and frozen and locked. There was no mold on the furniture, no mildew in the books. The bedding smelled clean. He told me he walked straight back to the shed and threw out the 3 electric dehumidifiers he had been fighting with on and off for 15 years because he was never going to need them again. 4 jars. $10 of salt, a problem that had beaten his family for 70 years, solved over a single winter by chemistry that costs less than lunch. Now, I want to answer the objections honestly, because I have been having this conversation with skeptical viewers for years, and I know exactly what some of you are thinking right now. First objection, isn't calcium chloride dangerous? No, not in any meaningful sense, and I want to be straight about it rather than wave it away. It is a salt. The very same compound is approved as a food additive. It is what firms up canned tomatoes and vegetables. It balances the mineral content in brewing water. It adds a touch of saltiness to certain cheeses, and it is what keeps pickles crisp instead of mushy. You have almost certainly eaten calcium chloride this week in your bread or your cheese or your canned goods and never knew it. The kind sold in 50-pound bags for de-icing and dehumidifying is the same chemical compound, just packaged for industrial use and not certified for direct eating. So there are 3 sensible rules. Do not eat it straight out of the bag. Do not let the concentrated brine sit on your skin for a long time, because it can be a little irritating. Keep it up out of reach of children and pets, the same way you would any household product under the sink. With those 3 rules, it is not toxic, not flammable, and not corrosive to skin in ordinary contact, and it has been used safely in homes for over 140 years. Second objection, doesn't the brine damage things if it spills? It can, and this is a fair point, so here is the honest answer. Calcium chloride brine can leave a white residue if it spills and dries, and it can corrode bare metal over time, particularly plain steel and aluminum. The fix is simple and costs $1. You set the jar on a small saucer or shallow dish, you keep it off direct metal surfaces, and you place it where a child or a cat cannot knock it down from a height. Do that and the problem disappears entirely. In all the years I have watched these jars used, the spills I have heard of came from a jar set too close to the edge of a high shelf, which is a problem any open container of liquid would have. Third objection, doesn't it only work in some climates? Yes and no, and I will give you the real answer. It works anywhere. The relative humidity runs above about 35%, which covers most of where people actually live. It works best in exactly the humid places where electric units struggle hardest and cost the most to run: the Southeast, the Gulf Coast, the Great Lakes, the Pacific Northwest, and any coastal area. In genuinely dry desert air, like the high country of Arizona or New Mexico, it does very little, but in that kind of air you do not need a dehumidifier in the first place, so the point is moot. The one place I would not lean on the jar alone is a space that has to hold a very precise narrow humidity band, like a cigar humidor or a room full of fine instruments, where you might want a controlled system working alongside it. For ordinary household damp, which is what plagues nearly everyone, the jar works almost everywhere you would ever want it to. And here is the thing about this jar that no machine can match. The thing that I think about more than any cost number. In a Mennonite farmhouse in Ontario, there is a stone cellar built back in the 1870s with limestone walls 2 feet thick and an arched stone ceiling, and on a shelf near the stairs sits a quart jar of calcium chloride under a square of muslin. The woman of the house walked me down there and pointed at it and told me that her grandmother set the first jar on that very shelf back in the 1920s, and that there has been a jar of salt on that shelf continuously ever since, for the better part of 100 years. They replace the salt twice a year. They replace the cloth every couple of years when it starts to stain. The jar itself has been swapped out 4 or 5 times over the decades when one cracked or got chipped. But a jar of salt has been quietly drying out that cellar without a single interruption for nearly a century, with no electricity, no machine, no repair bill, no failure, for a total cost over that entire 100 years of probably less than $200 in materials. Now, set that against the electric dehumidifier you bought 3 years ago that is already making that grinding sound that means the compressor is on its way out. Set it against the 4 or 5 machines your parents wore out and replaced over the course of their lives, every one of them headed to a landfill. Set it against the whole business model of the dehumidifier industry, which depends on you buying a new machine every few years and paying for the power to run it every single day. Her grandmother knew something in the 1920s that most of us managed to forget. The answer to humidity was never a machine. It was chemistry applied with a little patience and a little attention in a jar that has no moving parts to break, no electronics to fail, no refrigerant to leak, and no compressor to seize. It will still be drying that cellar long after the machine in your basement has been hauled to the curb. So here is what I want you to do this weekend. Build one jar, 2/3 full of pellets, a square of unbleached muslin tied down with twine, no metal lid, set on a saucer, placed in the dampest corner of your basement. $4 in 10 minutes. Then watch the brine collect over the next month and understand, in your own house, with your own eyes, that you were never required to plug humidity control into the wall and pay for it every day for the rest of your life. If you are the kind of person who believes that simple, real knowledge has been quietly set aside because there was no money in it for anyone but you, then you already know what to do next. Now, I want to hear from you in the comments. Tell me one thing. Which space in your house has the worst humidity problem? The basement, the closet, the bathroom, or somewhere else? And what have you been spending to fight it? I read every comment, and everyone helps the next person realize they are not the only one with a damp basement and a dehumidifier they keep replacing. And if this was useful to you, subscribe and stay with us, because there is a whole community here recovering the plane, practical knowledge that got buried while the rest of the country plugged itself into the wall and forgot. Next week, I am bringing you the way the Amish keep a root cellar full of vegetables fresh from October clear through to spring, no refrigeration, no electricity, using nothing but sand, straw, and one arrangement of the shelves that almost nobody outside their community has ever seen done right. Until then, build the jar. Set it on the shelf, and the first time you pour 1.5 pints of water out of the air of your own basement, water that cost you nothing and made no sound, you will understand exactly what Eli Stoltzfus meant when he told me that jar does what your humming machines do, only it never breaks and it never asks for anything except a spoonful of attention twice a year.